Joshua's helped me in ways that I never thought I'd need, right? I've spent time thinking about him and reading about his story, and as is woven through the scriptures with a different lens now. And I've come to see a man who said, you know what? If I'm up, I'm up. If it's my turn, it's my turn. And I think he was so sold out for God, he would have done anything. And that's where I'm at. It didn't matter what church or who I was coming after. I really just wanted to obey the Lord. And so that's sort of the story in a nutshell.
Welcome to the broadcast. This is Michael Easley inContext, and I'm pleased to have Dr. S. Jonathan Murphy on the program today. He's born in Belfast, Northern Ireland, but he was raised in the Canary Islands. He's also spent time in Spain and back in Northern Ireland for education, Edinburgh, Scotland, Dallas, Texas. He's a international man of travel and intrigue. He's the author of several books and Bible studies. His latest book, Authentic Influencer, is how we look at Barnabas' way of shaping lives for Jesus Christ. He also has a wonderful introduction to that book by our former governor friend Mike Huckabee, now the ambassador to Israel, I believe. In 2015, Dr. Murphy went to Dallas Seminary to teach in their homiletics and pastoral ministries department. And on May 1st of last year, 2024, Jonathan became the senior pastor at Stonebriar Community Church in Frisco, Texas. If you don't know that name, that church was founded by Chuck Swindoll in 1998, 26 years ago. And Chuck, by the way, turned 90 last October, and he finally retired and stepped aside, and the elders at Stonebriar made Jonathan their senior pastor. Jonathan is a fan of Ulster rugby and soccer in Spain. I guess you don't like soccer anywhere else?
No, probably just Spain, yeah.
He and Sarah Jean have 4 children, and it's a treat to have you on the program. Thanks for your time, Jonathan.
Oh, it's my pleasure to join you. Thank you for having me.
You
It's
and
a
I have
delight.
an interesting tapestry of connections about 2 decades apart with
Yeah.
our Dallas Seminary influence and Bible churches and Chuck Swindoll and others. Let's start for folks that, of course, may not know you. Give us a little bit about this history of yours from Ireland to Dallas, Texas.
Yeah, well, you covered it pretty well there in that bio. I grew up in Spain, in the Canary Islands. My parents were missionaries there from Northern Ireland, but I grew up as a Spanish kid, and I had never visited Northern Ireland until a few years into my childhood, as they would go back and forth on furlough. Eventually, for educational purposes, they sent my eldest brother and I back to boarding school there. And from there, I went to Scotland to do my undergraduate work. From there, I went to Texas to go to Dallas Seminary, did a PhD there as well, then pastored back in Belfast, and then came back to Dallas Seminary to teach again, really, in 2015. Was involved in a church here in Fort Worth, and then ultimately helping Chuck out. And then, as you said, May 1st, I was installed as the senior pastor, and we sort of made that switch.
So you must have picked up your Irish lilt when you were in boarding school then.
Yeah, so my parents, Northern Irish
Yeah.
parents in Spain. So our home was a Northern Irish home. My parents had to enforce English because we didn't speak English. And I'm one of 7. I'm the
Whoa.
second of 7. So everything was Spanish around us,
Yeah.
school, church. So they would enforce English at home. And of course, they're from Northern Ireland. That's the English version I learned,
Right.
and it's a very it's a very thick accent. So I mean, once you get it, it's hard to lose it. And then I guess it was topped up and established once I went to boarding school, and from there on in, it's stuck.
Of course, when you went back to pastor in Belfast, they said you don't sound Irish anymore, right?
Well, that's right. They got a little American twang, is what they would say, and poke fun at me for. But it is what it
Talk
is.
a little bit about the evangelical church in Ireland, because we typically think of Catholics, and that's about it.
Yeah, well, you see, there's 2 Irelands, right? There's Northern Ireland, and I don't mean just the geography of the North versus South. It's actually a separate country. Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom, with Scotland, England, and Wales. And then the south of Ireland, which is called the Republic of Ireland, is a completely separate sovereign entity. And so it's actually the Republic of Ireland that is predominantly Roman Catholic. The north is predominantly Protestant. And the split between the two really comes down to that, albeit initially, not so much today. And so, as it relates to the North, I would say if you think of the United Kingdom as a strong Christian nation, maybe 100 years ago and back, the remnants of that remain in Northern Ireland. There's a little Bible belt there of strong conservative evangelical Christians, which is beautiful. I mean, and it's not just an old versus secular young. There's lots of young believers there as well. So I think it's a lovely little spot in the world where God's doing a great work multi-generationally.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Let's go back in time a little bit. You grew up in a missionary household. How did you come to Christ?
Yeah. So I always say I didn't grow up as a missionary kid. I grew up as a pastor's kid. My parents were missionaries, but I had never known anything other than Spain. And so I grew up as a pastor's kid. And when your dad pastors a church and it's really a small church, it's a church plant initially. He populates it with his family, and so he had 7 kids. We were the youth ministry. we and so I ended up attending pretty much everything that they put on, as most sort of church families in Spain do. They do life together. It's not as split apart as we tend to do here. And so you'd be in big church, drawing on the floor while the adults, listen to the preacher, things like that. You'd be at of course, all the VBSs and all the Saturday morning kids clubs. So I heard the gospel repeatedly as a child, often through many missionary stories that they told us. And I was about 6 or 7 when I said, "Hey, Dad, I want to know Jesus personally. I want to be forgiven and I want to go to heaven to be with him one day." And so from a very early age, I came to Christ. And as a child, you want to make sure God heard you. So it's like every night, it's like, all right, I don't know if you forgot, Lord, but here's what I want. And so I don't recall not knowing the Lord, just because it was an early age.
Uh-huh.
Obviously, I matured since. So
That's wonderful. You too often you hear the overseas missions or church planting stories where the kids rebel.
yeah.
They grew up in a difficult environment. So bless God and your parents for doing an amiable job so their children follow Christ.
Yeah, and I think of that often now as a dad, and not looking at my parents as their son, but looking at my parents as, well, I'm a parent, and how do I help
Yes.
my kids grow in the ways of God? And so I reflect on them, and I go, "Wow, they were just genuine believers at home. They uh, talking to the Lord, reading the scriptures, being part of local church life was just the air we breathed. And I never experienced anything that made me go, I don't want that. That's restricting my life. It was always attractive and beautiful. So yeah, none of us, of the 7 of us, were all married. We're all married to Christian spouses, all involved in church work. I'm one of 4 boys, and all of us in ministry, and that's I think that's testament to my parents' faithfulness and the genuineness of their faith. I'm very blessed because I grew up in their home. So
That's
yes, yeah,
fabulous. That's great,
yeah,
great legacy. Well, let's
yeah,
talk a little bit about your training and ending up going to Dallas Seminary to teach, because pastoring in Belfast versus becoming a seminary professor, those are two different
yeah,
careers.
yeah. So I came to seminary from Scotland. After my undergraduate, I wanted to do a year Bible study somewhere. I was not thinking of the US, although I had heard of Dallas Seminary mainly through the ministry that it had had through its alumni in Spain, not in the
Okay.
UK. And so my dad and his buddy, who was a DTS graduate, caught wind of that. that I had an interest in going to a year Bible college. And so they organized for me to go to visit Dallas Seminary. I literally got an airline ticket through the post box in my apartment in Scotland with my name on it to hop on a plane. I didn't want to come because my then long-term girlfriend, now wife, had another year left to do at college. And I was thinking, no, I'm sticking around here. But God was in it, and He moved my heart, and so I trained to be a pastor. Uh, men that you've mentioned in the past, Dr. Toussaint,
Mm.
Dr. Pentecost, Dr. Hendricks, and also Dr. Elliot Johnson. I don't know if you remember
Yeah,
Elliot.
sure.
They all, when I was finishing up my THM, they all very much wrapped themselves around me and said, "You know what? God's moving you into PhD work for pulpit ministry.
Okay.
You're young, you can do it." So I kind of just followed their advice. I really lent on the community of wise men around me to hear God's voice. And so I did that. And while I was in the PhD, the pastoral ministries department asked me to come on as an adjunct and then an instructor. So I was teaching a few preaching classes there. But I wanted to be a local church pastor. I wanted to go back to Northern Ireland, to Europe in general, but Northern Ireland would be our first stop. I thought US has plenty of people here.
Yes.
And so we did. We went back. I pastored a little Baptist church there in a farming community. Very small. I loved it. These were people who didn't know what a PhD was, really, didn't care, but they loved the Lord. They wanted fed. And I really enjoyed my years there. But the seminary kept their tabs on me. They kept calling me back over those 7 years. And eventually in 2014, God made it very, very clear to me. I don't need to go down that story. I was Jonah-like in my response to God's call to return. I kept trying to head in the other direction. I was comfortable in Northern Ireland. We had a few kids by then. Our family was there. America has plenty of pastors and professors. But the Lord very graciously, I say the Lord very graciously broke me and brought me back. And it's been wonderful ever since. I ended up in the same department that I'd left, teaching the same classes that I'd taught. And so it's been wonderful ever since. So I think, long story short, it's because I'm in the pastoral ministries department that made life possible for me in an academic world. It allowed me to have a foot in the local church and a foot in academia, and I'm kind of a hybrid like that.
Hmm.
I need to be involved in a local church. I'm a churchman. That's the way God has wired me, and so pastoral ministries allowed for that. And so that's how we got to where we are now.
So obviously, you had filled the pulpit when Chuck Swindoll would take a break or need you to come help
Yeah.
out, and somewhere in there, the two of you begin connecting, and obviously, an incredible audience, congregation at Stonebriar,
Mm.
and they loved your teaching, they loved your attitude, your
Mm.
not to overstate it, but the accent never hurts. Americans love Irish and British accent. It gives you
That's
like a
true.
30% upscale for the rest of us.
Well, that's good because I need it.
Well, I often tease Alistair Begg. I said, you wouldn't be so good if you didn't have an accent.
I'm sure he agrees. I mean,
But being that,
I do.
I mean, following a guy like Chuck Swindoll is no small accomplishment. And I shouldn't say accomplishment, it's no small path because, I'm a bit older than you, but you're probably between you and Chuck about the same distance. And I remember over the years watching guys we so esteem, and there's a mindset, you stay in the pulpit till you die.
Yeah.
My generation, 60s and 70s, we acknowledge that, Jonathan, but we don't aspire to it. And there's something about, in fact, Hendricks said this many times, leave 3 years early, not 1 day late.
Mm.
And then we have this tension of you never retire. And so there's a
Yeah.
lot of competing interests in our heart and mind. And every pastor has a constituency. You always have a group of people that want you to stay and never leave and never retire. But there's always the other side of the bell curve that it's time for you to move on. So just as sort of a foundational comment, You're walking into something, you know enough about that church. We all love and respect Chuck to the end of the earth and back, but you're going to follow this guy. Talk about what
Yeah.
that's like initially and how you and your wife, Sarah Jane, processed through that decision.
Yeah. Well, it happened so gradually over many, many years. Chuck and I have been walking together privately, Chuck mainly talking to me about his desires for the future and for me to be part of his future and ultimately to hand things over to me long before it went public. And so it's not something that came upon me abruptly. Now, I was initially quite surprised that he would invite me into his life so intimately, but it's Chuck Swindoll. I was delighted to do that. And so for so many years, he would talk to me about just the church and life in ministry around here in a local church manner, that it wasn't something that struck me abruptly. So my point is, I grew into it with him. He did a great job of sort of taking my hand and walking me toward it, removing any fears. I got to know him so well that he still remained a huge hero of the faith, but he switched over to becoming, this is my friend, this is a mentor, this is someone who's like a father-like figure to me, spiritually speaking now. And so he ceased to be this uh, righteously intimidating figure to just my friend who was cheering me on from the front row, wanting nothing but the best for me. And of course, when you remove that, when you have that, then suddenly walking into a church setup that was where he was at became less intimidating. I was preaching up here, covering for him for many, many years. And so I got to know the congregation. They got to know me. Uh, I'm sure, as you said earlier, some are for you, some aren't. But it's been a very smooth process on that end. Certainly, the congregation has been fantastic, and I have felt very, very comfortable, and it's been a natural path, with no resistance from anyone. So it's been quite surprisingly enjoyable and beautiful. You mentioned the word follow. I've always seen it as, and Chuck and I would talk about this a lot, Moses and Joshua, Elijah and Elisha, Paul and Timothy to some extent. But with Moses and Joshua, we talk a lot about, and very little is said there as to how they actually did it in the nitty gritty of transfer there. And we would often leave the conversation essentially with this conclusion that Joshua didn't follow Moses. Joshua came after Moses. Moses followed God and Joshua followed God. It's just that Joshua followed God after Moses followed God. And so I think putting the focus not so much on I'm following Chuck, but I'm following God coming after Chuck really helps sort of uh, dissipate any tension, any expectations, any fears that might be there. And, Joshua's helped me in ways that I never thought I'd need, right? I've spent time thinking about him and reading about his story, and as is woven through the scriptures with a different lens now. And I've come to see a man who said, you know what? If I'm up, I'm up. If it's my turn, it's my turn. And I think he was so sold out for God, he would have done anything. And that's where I'm at. It didn't matter what church or who I was coming after. I really just wanted to obey the Lord. And so that's sort of the story in a nutshell.
And it's a fantastic observation, and I applaud it. I just know from the human level, people have followed me, I followed people, and there's always a transition. Gene Getz is a good friend, and I so applaud how Gene left Fellowship Bible North in Plano area because he'd been their founding pastor,
Yeah.
and he challenged all his elders, and he included himself in finding their replacements. and extraordinary book. Church Leaders and Elders, I think, is the title of the book. It's kind of a awkward title for the story, but the story about the transition is remarkable. But I could name 10 churches, Jonathan, that the transitions imploded.
Yeah.
And 18 to 24 month, hit the wall, ugly resignations, a lot of stuff comes out. In fact, I would use the word consultant lightly, but I've consulted a number of churches that it's an overcompensation, an overcorrection. Things don't go as planned, and it's very ugly in that 18 to 24 month wall. And now you're back on your heels again. And it seems as though Stonebridge, you guys, your elders are on a great path. They're supporting you. I mean, obviously there are changes, in style of leadership, involvement, things that were important to you versus were important to Chuck versus important to you. Elders are going to respond differently to a new pastor. So there's a lot of mitigating circumstances, not to mention attendance and budget and programs.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on.
Yes, there is. And, we're still in the early stages of a transition, as it's not one guy in, one guy out. It takes several years, as you well know. And so we're definitely aware that we're still in it. I think perhaps one of the factors that maybe has helped Chuck and I is our friendship. This was a friendship that's been going on for 7 or 8 years that he took the initiative in. And I think the other factor is we all love Chuck, but Chuck's 90. And so there's a very natural expectation that there has to be a shift that is occurring. That would be very different if Chuck was 70. I think the expectation from the congregation would be keep going, keep going, keep going. Why bring another guy in? So I think those factors have made it just a natural expectation of people, and it's certainly up to this point been great. When it comes to the inner workings of the church, yeah, there's things that need addressed that we're addressing. I'm a patient guy by nature. I'm not an impulsive decision maker, and so I'm quite happy to slowly, move things around and respect people along the way and not be abrupt. I'm in no rush. What am I rushing for? I want everybody, if possible, to be discipled along the way and to move with us. Now, there are some who can't,
Yeah.
who can't. But if we can, it's worth striving for. And as long as you have a good elder team, and we do, then I think you've a head start. So we'll see.
When I'm in a group of two other pastors, three of us, and we've done a series of podcasts kind of testing the water. All of us have had 40 plus years of ministry. And one of the questions we entertained a few weeks ago was what we do differently looking back after many years. And it was fairly agreed upon, all three of us, that we'd have focused on discipleship and evangelism at the exclusion of infrastructure and programs, because the programs become good things in and of themselves. But this XYZ ministry that might need, 80, 100 volunteers to execute, they might share Christ along the way.
Yeah.
It might be by the way, part of the ministry, but it's not the focus. And as you know, the mandates are to make disciples of all ethnos, not to create programs and buildings. And yet out of buildings flow ministry, out of buildings flow opportunity. But at the same time, the pastor has the bully pulpit in the right way. And I've listened to some of your messages and been appreciative of your comments about evangelism, sharing Christ, being clear about the gospel, as well as discipleship. And, in my years, Cindy and I were involved with small group ministry, and I would say some of them were really discipleship focused. But you're going against the grain of the whole church program when you try to make disciples and exclusion. All these great programs that they get people out on the weekends and weeknights, and they do great Bible studies, and it's not bad, Jonathan, but it just seems to be off mission. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're correct. One of the ways I'm trying to deal with that here, and I think that's where coming from a small Christian communities in places like Spain initially, which are small and very much in societies that are hostile to them, and to some extent in Northern Ireland, also relative to the US, not relative to Spain. Northern Ireland, as I said to you earlier as we chatted, is a little bit of a Bible belt in the UK. There's a strong Christian presence, but relative to the US is obviously very small. And in those two areas, the what I grew up in was a church family. Like you belonged to a community of people and you did life with those people. And it was very natural. It wasn't a show up for an event once or twice a week at a building that we've assigned to be sacred space. Your life revolved around one another throughout the week. And I think that meant that you were nearly being discipled as you talked about God in the comings and goings of regular life without it being a programmatic discipleship program. It was more organic. And so that's what I'm trying to instill a little bit here at Stonebriar. We have many programs, maybe too many, uh, and we're looking at that, but certainly getting to the core of we're brothers and sisters in Christ. We're children of God. We're the household of God. We're a family unit. That's a core identity of what it means to be a local church. And so creating a family belonging type environment, I have seen has really energized people. It has made people go, I want a part of that. I want to be a part of a community that knows me a little bit more intimately than just a handshake on a Sunday morning when the guy up front says, "Hey, greet the guy beside you." So moving the mind shift away from church is an event in a place once a week where you're primarily silent, listening to a guy, to church is a community of people of God who are participating in each other's lives, and because of that are growing discipleship and on mission naturally, but that they do corporately gather at the weekend as well. That's where I'm heading, and I find that people love that. You know, Chuck is such a beloved global pastor that you would have had a lot of people who would have seen Stonebriar as a conference church, a weekend conference where you go and listen to a great preacher of the Word of God, and that's beautiful. But you know, coming after him, not being a global pastor like that, we're trying to add to the weekend conference event. We're around here all the rest of the week, and you can be in each other's lives and in each other's homes, and it'd be beautiful. So that's where I'm at with it. Don't know if it fully answers your question, but
Well,
uh,
I mean, it's sort of an ambiguous question because you have unique cultures, unique geography, unique traffic. I mean, North Dallas, Frisco has become, a
yeah,
bustling, busy, difficult place to get around. And one of the things that these pastor friends of mine talked about was the expectations we burdened people with. One of
mm,
my friends was a pastor of a very large Baptist church here in the area, and he said he would apologize today to basically good shaming. Come to the men's breakfast on Saturday morning.
yeah,
Come to the men's cookout.
yeah,
Because you're taking that Saturday time frame from a family where most of those guys are working, 50 plus hours a week. They're not engaged as dads, and the 2 days they're kind of around full time. You're taking them away for a church event,
yeah,
and so I mean, your depiction of Northern Ireland is quite Edenic,
mm,
compared to the culture of and when you have Mothers Day Out programs and you have kids in sports or instruments or activities, and you have high schoolers that are driving cars, and you have double incomes and people that are going to
yeah,
work early and late, and you're asking one more thing from the church. It's tough, and
yeah,
um,
yeah.
and,
That's
and it changes in different areas, right? In rural areas versus where you are, it's the church is a complex ministry organism, no matter where you are.
Yeah. You know what? You know, now that you've said that, that first book I wrote, Authentic Influencer, it's the Barnabas way of shaping lives for Jesus. And the whole point of that book is that Barnabas is this guy who influences anybody he comes into contact with right where God has him in life. And so, you know, he only pops in and out of the scriptures in Acts several times, but every time he pops up, you know, people around him are naturally influenced by him. Obviously, predominantly Paul and that, but Barnabas is introduced as just a regular member of the church who puts his hand in his pocket because there's needs in the community. But he also, when you move on in Acts, seems to become what you and I would call the senior lead pastor of Antioch. And then he becomes a missionary. And so at every single turn, there's a natural uh, Christ-like influence that he exerts on people in his surroundings, and that's been a model that I've tried to push on people over the years. I don't need you to be here. You're in places where I can't be or where others can't be, and God has called you just to be a natural influence for Christ there, and that's ministry. Now, I do think it's important that you at least gather at the weekend for the corporate gathering of the church, but you don't have to be at the men's ministry, the kids' ministry, and all of these other activities in order to minister, right? You can be at the, you know, butcher's, baker, candlestick maker environments and be in ministry in places that the church organized activities can't reach. And I think the response from people has been very freeing. I didn't know that I could serve Jesus in that way. You know, they have the pressure of, but I don't know the gospel or how to articulate it the way you do. And I'm not good with words. And I feel pressure to have to go into work and say, hey, do you know Jesus? And seeing somebody like Barnabas, I think, has inspired people to go, oh, I can do that. I can be generous. I can be encouraging. I can be in it for the long haul with an individual and ultimately maybe help them see the gospel and come to know Jesus Christ, you know. So that's a good thought, you know, and certainly that's what I'm trying to live my life and lead others toward.
Now, understanding you only been there a little over a year in your new role, very likely some younger pastor is hearing this conversation at some point. Maybe he's in his late 20s or early 30s, and you know, he's praying about what's next, and maybe he's going to follow an established church. 2 or 3 points that Dr. Murray would tell him to keep front and center.
So as I look at some of the key verses that have become mottos in my life, one that reaches way, way back into the early days of my seminary is in 1 Thessalonians 4, where Paul says, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life.
I love it.
I mean, in the margin of my Bible, it's I've got the date when I really felt, Lord, that's for me. That's the way I want to live. And to this day, my dad laughs that for all my pursuits of wanting to live a quiet life, uh, that's been nearly the opposite. But that remains to this day. I am naturally by personality, by temperament, someone who likes anonymity, somebody who doesn't necessarily want to be up front at all. And I now have seen that to be a real blessing to me. It's not false humility. It's true. And it's set me up well because it means that I'm not grasping after anything. And if it goes away tomorrow, I'm a happy man. I'm back to the make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. And so I would say, hey, make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. I mean, don't fall into the trap of thinking that bigger is better, that more well known is more blessed by God, that there's a ladder to climb, that that is a metric of your usefulness to God and your success in God's eyes. None of that is true. None of that is true. If all of that is true, my parents' ministry or anybody who's ever ministered in Europe and certainly in Spain has been a failure in the eyes of God. And so God measures fidelity, stewardship, not size, not how many people know you, what size the church is. And that is at the core of where I'm at. Uh, I've seen it modeled for me, I guess, is what I'm saying. Uh, Good servant leadership patterned after the way of Jesus Christ was modeled for me long before I knew it was being modeled for me. And I now, as an adult, look at that and I go, man, you showed me Christ. And that's way better than some of the nonsense that's out there in the evangelical Christian world. So make it your ambition to lead a quiet life. Pursue anonymity. Pursue obscurity. Enjoy whatever flock God gives you, no matter what size they are, because you ultimately serve the Lord Jesus Christ. And his metric is not size of influence, platform, any of that nonsense. That's just, frankly, nonsense. Without taking away the desire to influence the most people that we can possibly
Yeah.
influence for the Lord Jesus Christ.
It's
So,
a balancing knife edge sometimes, and I laugh when you read that verse because that's probably one of my most epic failures in life. Is living a quiet life. I'm
yeah,
first to speak and last to shut up. I read a book in probably the early '80s. I can't remember the author, but it was God has not called you to be successful; He's called you to be faithful. And
yeah,
that was one of those rock my worlds going, Michael, be faithful and don't worry about success. And if it
yeah,
comes or not on a Western standard, because that's how we gauge it, right? Bigger, better, newer, more. You go up to student pastor, becomes assistant pastor, becomes
yeah,
whatever, plant a church and grow a church in multiple campuses. And there's this always looking, around who's got the next ministry, success story. And some of it's well-intentioned. I mean, some of it's
yeah,
how to reach the community for Christ.
correct.
But too often the business takes over the church and it loses being a ministry.
Yeah, and my eyes were open to that predominantly when I came to the North American Christian context. That is not the case where I come from, and I look at it now and go, "What a blessing to not have had that as part of the environment," because it it took away in my inner being any expectation that certain metrics would be connected to success, and so I still think that we have to make sure that we adopt here the mindset that the metrics of success, as you mentioned, is fidelity. There's a quote I have in the other book by a guy called Ralph Davis. He says, accomplishments don't matter, fidelity does." And I love that. I mean, of course, accomplishments do matter if they're rightly motivated, but the point is that pursue being faithful, whatever that is. That's right smack in the New Testament teaching
The
of the
talents.
Gospels.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we very easily forget that, or we use that language with an ulterior motive to still strive for bigger, better. And I just object to that because as I said earlier, it smacks right down the line of being a failure in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
We're all failures in Europe if that's the metric. And I'm like, I just don't accept that. I don't accept that. We've tried very, very hard to reach people for Christ and to grow our churches in the faith. And the the culture is different.
Yeah.
And
It's hard.
so
It's
yeah,
hard.
it's very, very hard. Yeah.
Yeah, so many things to talk about. It's been great getting to know you a little bit more, Jonathan. I thank you for your time, and I would use this opportunity for our listeners and viewers. Pray for your pastors. Pastoring is a multifaceted, mercurial, impossible to define role. Expectations come from all sides of the church family, from the communities, from the non-Christian world around us. It's a unique place. Maybe it's a calling, maybe it's a gifting, however you want to discuss it. But, your pastor is a flawed, sinful person, and he needs your prayers, he needs your support, he needs your encouragement, and he needs a Barnabas. He needs someone that'll come alongside. So pray for Jonathan. Pray for Stonebriar Community Church. It's got a wonderful opportunity there in the Frisco area. They're doing some very important ministry. But Jonathan, Cindy, and I attend a church here in Middle Tennessee, and our pastor, Darren Tyler, is the most globally minded guy I've ever met. Every Sunday morning, he prays for a church by name, the pastor by name, and he knows what's going on in that church to a degree. And some of the churches are outside a theological comfort zone, if you will.
Yeah.
But he's praying for them. And I look over at Cindy and we shake our heads going, why did we miss this all of our lives? That the body of Christ comes in many forms and fashions. Maybe we're different theologically. Maybe we have some real differences, but there are men and women who love Christ, and they need courage and encouragement, right, to carry out this great commission.
Yeah, we're a family.
Yep.
And I keep saying there's no better community amongst humanity than the Church of Jesus Christ. I mean, I cannot tell you how many times I've popped into a church somewhere in the world and gone, I've never met these people. I will never see them again. And yet these are my people. And I feel like I belong, because our focus is in the same direction. And I don't think there's a group amongst all of humanity that can provide that for anyone. So absolutely pray for your pastors. We need it.
Yes, they do. Well, Jonathan, it's a delight to have you on. We'll get you back sometime in the near future, maybe do a part 2 a year from now and say, how is it going now?
Yeah, that'll be great. Yeah, hopefully it'll be great. But we'll learn either way. It's something.
Well, God bless you, and thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you.